everybody. Hello. Good morning. Welcome to the Fall 2015 In-Service Day. Thank you, first of all, to the Caterpillar faculty and Mike Toscano and Deans Murphy and Ochoa Sanchez and Vice President of Operations Calderon and Trustees Rivera, Moreno, Vasquez, and Mathis for the wonderful service and breakfast that we all enjoyed just a little bit ago. I was saying to somebody that I very distinctly remember, and by the way, I don't remember very much from back there, but when I first came to Delta in 1994, that was one of my first experiences, is that pancake breakfast. And it's really stuck in my mind. It's really a real tradition here at the college. I want to introduce the board members who are here. I think there are just three. Claudia Moreno is our board vice president. Janet Rivera is the board clerk. And Richard Vasquez is a board member. Dr. Mathis was here earlier, but she had to go to work. And Teresa Brown is with our student trustee in somewhere at a trustee training. So Trustee Stebbins, and I'm not sure where Trustee Castellanos is, but I'm sure they'll be here sometime during the day. So to everybody new at the college, I want to welcome all of you. We are so delighted to welcome you to our great college. We know you will contribute significantly to our mission and goals, and we recognize that you are our future, and a very bright one at that. To all of you who have been away for the summer, welcome back. We hope you had a restful or exciting or fun-filled summer and that you're ready to get back to teaching and learning with students and staff. To all of you who have been here most of the summer, my apologies. But we hope that you've gotten away for at least a little downtime to reflect on the past year and plan for 2015-16, which I hope is going to be our best year ever. To everyone, thank you all, managers, faculty, and staff, for all that you do for Delta College, for our students, and for our community. As you know, students and the community are the reasons why we're all here, and certainly why we all get a paycheck every month. Each and every one of us, managers, faculty, staff, plays important roles in the success of our students. We recruit them, we welcome them, we help them apply, we assess their skills, we orient them to the ways of the college. We help them get the resources they need to attend. We counsel them. We help them create their educational plans, and we help them register for classes. We teach them. They learn from us and from each other. We teach them what they should have known before they came here. We have high expectations for them, but we help them meet those expectations by providing tried and true individual and group assistance. We test them, assess them, whether they've achieved the learning outcomes that we've set for our classes. And then we talk about how we could teach and learn more effectively with the students that we have. We give them grades and courses. We move them through our programs, and we reward them with well-earned degrees and certificates. We help them find the four-year degree institutions or send them to find rewarding and fulfilling and well-paying jobs. We awaken their interests. We help them integrate and make their curriculum coherent. We teach them the value of diversity in all its aspects. We prepare them for careers and we teach them the trades. We help them learn research methods and introduce them to the arts. We foster their athletic abilities. We urge them to continue learning by gaining degrees, by transferring, by getting certificates, or by becoming more skilled, more effective employees. We tutor them, provide IT support, and maintain computer labs so they can do their work and take online classes. We clean their classrooms. We fix what is broken, upgrade what needs to improve. We make the grounds look beautiful despite the drought. We buy equipment for them, from beakers to electron microscopes. We sell them food, books, school supplies, and other stuff. We give them places to congregate and make friends. We develop their leadership capabilities. We help them find extracurricular activities. We take them on field trips. We take care of their children while they're in class. We hire individuals to provide all of these services and many others. We take their money for what they owe, and we keep the district afloat through careful stewardship of our resources. There's not a single person who works at this college who doesn't contribute to the student experience or to student success. All of you are so important and so valued. Thank you for all that you do to ensure our students' success and the success of the college. We all contribute to the community as a whole in lots of ways. We collaborate with outside businesses, industries, and organizations. We provide programs and courses that meet the community's needs. We listen to the community's needs. We articulate what we do with the schools and the colleges our students transfer to. We support community organizations and events. In other words, we all contribute to what makes Delta great and to what makes our students and community successful. I am so grateful to each and every one of you for all you do every day. Appreciated, valued, and acknowledged for all that you do. I know the Board of Trustees is with me on this. Thank you all. Enjoy the great presentations and workshops today, and we'll see you next week at Welcome Week. Those of us who have these polo shirts will be out there with polo shirts and buttons welcoming the students. So have a great day today.
Well, welcome everybody, and this shows how long it's been since I've been in the classroom to run the AV system. Ready? So welcome, everybody. And Scott, I know you're out there. That's payback. So if I could have, just very quickly, the Management Senate President, Nancy Cook, Diane Oren, the Academic Senate President, come join me on stage. Susan Rodriguez, come join me on stage at this point, Classified Senate President. Thanks, Susan. Diane?
Good morning. I'm Susan Rodriguez, Classified Senate President. So if I could have all our new classified employees that were just hired, and some have been here maybe 1 or 2 days, while others have been here since last August. So if you could all please stand so we can recognize you. I know we saw your picture, but we'd like to see you.
And now the people that have direct contact with the reason that we are here, but I would like to have the new faculty please stand and be recognized. We are really glad to see you. New faculty. And my mantra is just remember you are responsible for the retirement parties for the rest of us.
I know I don't look like Nancy Cook. She's a lot prettier. Oh, Stella. On behalf of the managers, the Management Senate, I'm the past president, and so I'd like to welcome all of you here today. And I'd like the managers, the recently hired managers, to please stand. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, you guys. So it's my pleasure to turn this over now to Lisa Cooper, our Assistant Superintendent, Vice President of Student Services, who will have the honor of introducing our first keynote speaker, Jay Gooseby-Smith. Thanks, Lisa.
Good morning and welcome to all of our new Delta employees. We're so glad to have you here. Now it's my honor to introduce Dr. Jay Gooseby-Smith. She was most recently a tenured professor at Pepperdine University and has most recently accepted a position starting this fall at the Citadel as an associate professor of business and the director of their graduate leadership programs. She has co-authored a text called Beyond Inclusion, and we'll be speaking on that topic today, having done extensive research on inclusive practices in organizations. So without further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Smith to join me on stage.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me here. I wanted to thank Student Success for inviting me, and also to say I'm looking forward to talking with you all about this topic because it's near and dear to me, and also because I've realized through doing the research that I come at it through a lens that isn't necessarily always talked about. So a brief agenda, glad to be here. I'll tell you a teeny bit about myself in picture form, and then we'll sort of launch into the topic for the day. As Dr. Cooper said, I have made the transition geographically from Pepperdine University in Malibu to the Citadel in South Carolina. So we've gone coast to coast, driven across country, and flown back here, and we're glad to be back in California, at least for now. So I'm going to sort of share with you in an effort at transparency what my premise is, because I like to let people know where I'm coming from, and then I'll share a little about the research. So this is a little bit of a scattergram diagram of me. I've been a faculty member at Pepperdine University, in the Cal State system, and at Butler Universities, and so I'm going into the Citadel, which is great because a lot of my research focuses on inclusion for veterans in higher education and diversity and inclusion issues of active duty service members. So the Citadel is a great fit, and I'll also be director of their graduate programs in leadership. So my premise is that you can read, but essentially that there's been a lot of systemic and institutional issues that have affected many people, and as a result, many people don't experience inclusion in organizations. And that in order to increase this inclusion experienced in organizations and to decrease the pain that is often felt in the workplace, we need a paradigm shift. And so part of the research that I did, I'm going to share with you. But before I get into the research, I'd like to share with you what I mean by a paradigm shift. So most of us are pretty much taught, we always know Rodin's the thinker, but we've always been taught, I think, therefore I am. Well, if you think about that premise, it really supposes that the reason that we are is because we think that we are. So it's a really sort of self-focused micro image of existence. And so the paradigm shift that I'm talking about has to do with Ubuntu. It's an African philosophy or way of thought which doesn't say, I think, therefore I am. It says, I am because you are, which means that we exist in interdependence with each other. And so much of what Dr. Hart spoke about during the introduction had to do with the roles that we play in students' lives, the roles that students play in our lives, and we are an interdependent whole. And my premise is that if we can shift from seeing ourselves just as our own work products or just as our own work teams or just as our own organizations and sort of strengthen the social fabric that exists in our organizations, we will be much better off to impact inclusion. So, before we start to talk about what I mean by inclusion, I wanted to give you a little bit of the terminology that I'm using and what I mean when I use those terms, because I've noticed that many universities have their offices of inclusion, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the Office of Equity and Diversity, the Office of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, and we have all these things, and when we talk, we use these terms as if they're synonymous, but to me, they're not. For example, the first term, equity. Equity to me implies comparison. It implies fairness and people being treated equally and fairly. Within the field of diversity and inclusion management, equity oftentimes pertains to laws and policies that are set to try to ensure that people are treated fairly. Do they always work? No. But are people treated a little bit better as a result of some of the laws? Absolutely. We've seen a lot of progress in that area. But when I say inclusion, I'm not just talking about equity. Another term that we hear quite a bit is the term diversity. Some people even use diversity as a code word. So they'll say, we need to hire some diverse faculty members. Well, we all know what that means. We need to talk about our diverse students. Well, diversity is a characteristic of a group. It's not a characteristic of individuals. And so I want you to think of a metaphor of a garden. So to me, diversity represents the types of flowers that are planted in the garden. So as you can see, you've got tall ones, you've got short ones, yellow ones. And when you think about our faculty discussions and our student recruiting discussions, they go something like, well, the roses are doing really well in the garden, but the daisies, we're so concerned about the daisies here. So when we talk about how are we going to recruit more daisies, what do the daisies need? Are we going to have to let some roses go? So diversity has to do with which types of flowers are planted in the garden. Bringing that into a school context, diversity has to do with what types of people are planted into the San Joaquin Delta College community. But diversity is far more complex than we normally talk about it. We usually talk about race, or gender, or if we're lucky, orientation, nationality. But there are lots of dimensions of diversity. The internal dimensions, those are the ones about the characteristics about ourselves that we just cannot change. The external dimensions, those are things that sometimes change for better or for worse. Marital status, which way is good, which way is bad, it just depends on the situation. But geographic location, parental status is a dimension of diversity that we often don't talk about in organizations, but it's huge because it has impacts for faculty for course scheduling. I remember when I first started at Pepperdine University in 2002, I had my daughter in 2004, I needed a 2-day-a-week, 3-day-a-week teaching schedule because I could not afford full-time daycare as a faculty member because it was, thousands of dollars per month. So parental status matters as far as a dimension of diversity in colleges. Also, religion, recreational habits, and then you look at the outer dimensions. Where do you work? What is your status? Are you classified? Are you exempt? Are you full-time? So when you think about diversity and all those different types of flowers that are planted in that garden, think of diversity in all of its different manifestations. Additionally, I would challenge you, when you look at diversity and look at making the college even more excellent than it is, think about the intersectionality of these identities. Because you can't just think about race, you can't just think about gender, you can't just think about freshman college student, it's the intersection of those things. The experience of a Latina who is female, who is a first-generation college student, is very different than the experience, perhaps, of a black male who is a first-generation college student who is also first-generation. So it really does matter to sort of make our thoughts about these topics more sophisticated. But inclusion, that's not what I'm talking about either. Both equity and diversity intersect with inclusion, as I'll talk about later, but the terms are not synonymous. So when I talk about inclusion, back to our metaphor of the garden, to me, inclusion is the soil into which all of these flowers are planted. And so there is some soil that is really inclusive and accepts just about anything to grow and thrive and make the garden more beautiful. There's other soil that you just can't grow anything in. So some organizations are non-inclusive, meaning plants are dying when they're planted into it, and it's non-diverse. So when you have organizations, colleges like that, everybody shares a lot of similarity and they're all kind of dying together. That's not a good thing. That's not a good thing. So it's non-inclusive and non-diverse. I'm doing this kind of jokingly, but I'm trying to get you to decouple those two terms. Some organizations are non-inclusive, meaning that the plants are not thriving, but they are diverse. So there are lots of different types of plants here, but none of them look like they're really in too good of a shape. Other organizations are, okay, I'm clicking faster than I can think. Other organizations are inclusive, meaning that the soil is great, it's thriving, but they're non-diverse. The plants share a lot of common similarities. If I have my choice, I would go into an inclusive organization that wasn't very diverse versus one that was very diverse and not inclusive, because I want to be where I can thrive. So it's really important to keep these terms separate, because when you're working on campus inclusion and when you're working on campus diversity, there will be points of intersection, but different tasks require different mindsets and different methodologies. Finally, there are some organizations that are both diverse and inclusive. You have a variety of plants thriving, and that's both an inclusive environment because they're growing, and it's diverse because they're different plants. So what do I mean by inclusion? So to summarize my research in about 30 seconds, what I did, my co-author is Josie Lindsay, and she's an organizational development practitioner, and I'm the bookish, nerdish person. And so what we did, we talked via focus groups, face-to-face interviews, online surveys, nearly 7,000 people in 3 different multinational organizations. And to protect the innocent, the first organization I called Big Store in the book. That was a multinational retailer. The second organization in the book was was a big school. That was a pretty large college with about 10 to 15,000 students. And then there was Big Bank. That's a large multinational financial conglomerate. And the question that I asked people was, tell me about a moment when you experienced an extreme sense of inclusion, when you really felt welcomed and that you belonged. And there were open-ended questions. And so as a result, ended up with this much data, and through a lot of qualitative analysis, for those of you that like research, we have an inter-rater reliability of almost 100%, because the goal of this research was to come up with, regardless of what those dimensions of diversity were, whether people were male, female, faculty, staff, student, part-time driver, president, CEO, what were the commonalities and what made people feel included. And we came up with 7 dimensions, and I'll go through those dimensions very quickly. For those that may happen to go to the breakout session, I'll talk with them in more detail. But the first dimension was connection. People feel most included when they feel a sense of connection. Their leaders and the organization's purposes itself. People also feel most included when they experience a sense of care. And that essentially means simple things that really, really matter. Some of the peak moments of inclusion that we found out from people in their organizations were as simple as, when I got on the elevator, the president of the university, the president of the college, the president of the company spoke to me. Another peak moment of inclusion was my manager sent me a birthday card. So a lot of these things that make people feel included are not high-ticket items. You don't need a multi-million-dollar inclusion initiative. The things that make people feel most included are the interpersonal transactions that we have. I'll talk about them more in the breakout session. The third dimension was intrapersonal. Many times people talk about inclusion and they're talking about something that someone's going to do to them. They're talking about something that the faculty is going to do in the classroom to make students feel included, or something that administrators are going to do to make the faculty feel more included, or something that the board is going to do to make the administrators feel more included, or something that the managers are going to do to make the staff feel more included, when there's a huge intrapersonal, within ourselves aspect of inclusion. These are the thoughts, the perceptions, and the things that we tell ourselves. For example, you've gone into meetings and sat down and thought, they really don't want to value my point of view, or I'm the only one from my department here and they don't think we're important. All that self-talk impacts how inclusive we are. I am not saying that just because we come in arms open wide expecting to be included that we will be, but you can almost guarantee that if you come into a situation assuming that you're not going to be included, you come up with your guard up, that's going to impact the inclusion that we feel. Next dimension is communication. When people felt that they were in the communication loop, that they knew what was going on, that they were listened to, they felt most included. And it's important to realize these aren't just things that I'm sort of making up. These are commonalities of things that people have said when we ask them, what has been your peak moment of inclusion in your organization of your whole time in this organization? And when someone says that my boss asked me my opinion and I gave it to him or her, and then he or she told me they implemented the idea, that is a peak moment of inclusion. And so I challenge those of you in here that are managers or administrators or in faculty members as well, when a student or a staff member or someone gives you a good idea and you implement it, let that person know. That just might make their career inclusion highlight reel. Mentoring and coaching. We kind of expected that people who had mentors and coaches would feel more inclusive, successful in the organization. What we didn't expect, though, was that the feeling of being mentored, the experience of being mentored, made people feel most included, and the experience of being a mentor made them feel most included. And that sort of makes sense, because if I'm able to mentor someone else, I'm able to impart my knowledge and share my skills and abilities, and it means the organization kind of values me, and there is value in giving. And so we didn't particularly expect to find that when people mentored other people, that was what made them feel included. The next one is visibility. When people have a chance to give a presentation or stand up and present to faculty meetings or they're acknowledged for doing a good job, having visibility really matters, particularly from their superiors and from their peers. The idea of being valued and shown to be valuable in front of peers really matters. So a lot of things in the book that fell into that category were being able to present, being able to have your voice and your name be attached to an idea. The next dimension was reward. People, when they were rewarded for the hard work that they did, they felt extremely included. And that reward really didn't have to do a lot. Of course, as educators, we all are underpaid, regardless of what we do. We're all underpaid. It's just absolutely the truth. But as far as reward, sometimes the reward was something as winning a faculty award and being presented with a gift certificate. So being rewarded for doing a good job, these are simple things, but how often do we only talk with people to criticize them versus rewarding them when they do a good job? Fairness. Without fairness and perceptions of fairness, there is no inclusion. People do not feel included when they don't feel that they are treated fairly. This, the fairness most close, I don't know why I'm clicking so fast, this thing is going past me. Maybe it's a delay. For the equality, that is most closely related to equity. So we said equity had to do with fairness. That's related to equity. Next, we had trust. Without trust, and I always wonder with this picture, what is he gonna make it? You know, and she's all in. She's all in. But is she gonna make it? People felt most included, both when they could trust their peers and when they could trust the people to whom they reported, but they also felt most included when they were trusted. So I remember a person at Big Store, several people, their peak moment of inclusion was when they got a key to the store, so they could be the one to close the store down, or they were entrusted with making the deposits. So when you bring it into the college classroom, a lot of times we just don't trust our students. A lot of times we just don't trust people to do things or trust people to hold their ground. And so when we're able to trust people and when we're trusted, we feel most included. Finally, all 7 of those dimensions also took place with external stakeholders. So the visibility of being able to present at an academic conference, or to be able to go out to the community and talk at a trade show, or feeling cared about because a community member called and said I did a good job and wanted to talk with me, or feeling connected to the community. So giving students chances to talk with students at other schools, chances to talk with students who are in other classes, faculty presenting at conferences. A lot of times when we go out and talk at our conferences and we have on that badge that says Delta College, that makes us identify as Delta College. So it makes sense that talking externally would make you feel more included in your home organization. Why does it matter? Many organizations think just because they diversify the college, that's going to result in perceptions of inclusion. That is the biggest misnomer. It doesn't mean that you've taken care of the soil. So in order to take care of the soil, it means we need to have inclusive culture, inclusive leadership, inclusive processes. And in the end, because I know we're running a little bit behind, I'm going to compress back. These things lead to individual senses of effectiveness, which makes us enter our teams more effectively. Have you ever been in a meeting where there's someone who just has a lot of intrapersonal stuff going on, and they come into the meeting and they bring all this stuff and they sort of just lay it on the table, and it had nothing to do with anyone at the meeting, but now we've sort of got to deal with that? That has a negative impact on the effectiveness of the team. So when people do feel included and they feel more of a sense of safety and engagement, they enter into teams better. And I'll go one better. How often have you been on a team of highly effective people? So we're going to pick all the best people for this team, but then to use a technical term, being on the team just sucks. You know, it's just a really bad experience. We're all smart, but the team is just really dysfunctional. Sometimes that's because the team itself doesn't have inclusive behavior, inclusive leadership, and inclusive processes, how to deal with conflict, how to have dialogue. And so once we get the best out of our teams, then we kind of get to inclusive organizations if we have inclusive strategies and structures and policies. And one of the things that I've been so impressed with my time at Delta College is that Dr. Cooper has a really integrated view of what it means as far as inclusion. In fact, I collected a little bit of data from people who attended a retreat that they did in June to look at student effectiveness and how to make students more successful. And it was just amazing from the input I got from just pinging a few people who attended that retreat, how transformative that was. And so I've encouraged Dr. Cooper to look at what were the ingredients in that retreat and try to figure out what those things are so that we can replicate them, because it was really transformational. So you end up with college effectiveness, but a lot of times people think just because I diversify, it's going to make the organization better. That's a false statement. It's an oversimplification. And so final thought is that every interaction we have matters. Every student that you speak to, every faculty member that you speak to, many of the peak moments of inclusion of people in the book whose ideas they shared was that someone spoke to me. A person said thank you. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm glad to be here. And I'll talk with the rest of you in more detailed breakout. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Gooseby-Smith. The focus on moments of inclusion is a nice theme, and we have an event coming up next week that I think is going to provide many moments of opportunity for including students. And I want to just call out very briefly Asia Butler and the Office of Student Activities for organizing next week the new Student Welcome Week, which is going to give so many great opportunities for students to learn about the college, to experience the college in a positive way. There will be opportunities for them to learn about programs, academic programs, support programs throughout the campus starting next Monday. And what I'd like to do is encourage the faculty particularly to talk up the Welcome Week with students. You should be receiving in your mailboxes the Welcome Week card with all of the events listed on it. And particularly to mention to students on the first day or Tuesday, the convocation that will take place for the college. This will be something we're going to try to do. I think Asia wants this as a regular tradition that we start. So new student convocation will be in Tilly Lewis at 12:30 on Tuesday with a welcome from Dr. Hart and a great speech as well. So talk that up with your students next week, and thank you, Asia, for all the work you're doing on that. In way of introducing Luke Wood and Frank Harris, I just want to talk about a happy sort of confluence of events that took place in the spring. Luke and Frank had been invited to the RP Group's annual conference in April to do the keynote speech, and I was glad that that was happening because I was president of RP, still am. And at the same time, roughly, a group of faculty, staff, managers who had gone to a conference, including Delicia Nunnally, Evan Wade, Roy Desmangles, Solon Laney, had met with a number of us on the executive leadership team, and one of the ideas that they pitched to us was, you need to invite Luke and Frank to do a keynote at Delta College, and we delivered on that. Luke and Frank have been doing some incredible work on tracking patterns of success of men of color in the community college system, and they've created and established and nurtured this growing network of community college professionals that are focused on these issues through their M2C3 collaborative. It's mentioned in the program. It's a real honor for me to introduce Luke up to the stage for his keynote address, and remember that we've got sessions with both Luke and Frank later in the day. So Luke, please come up and let's give him a warm welcome.
Okay, there we go. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and for having us here today. I'd like to begin by thanking the board members, Dr. Kathy Hart, President Superintendent, Matt Wetstein, Vice President of Instruction, for bringing us here. We truly appreciate it. Dr. Lisa Cooper and other members on campus, and all of you for being here. We've had an opportunity really to be engaged in work that's been focused on men of color in community colleges for some time now. And today serves as an opportunity for us to share some of the things that we've learned with you in support of equity efforts that are taking place here, but as well as those taking place around the state. So this session here will just kind of give a general overview of some of the things that we've learned. And then we'll have the 2 breakout sessions that focus specifically on teaching and learning and how to work effectively and educate effectively men of color. So for those of you who are actively engaged on social media, we are as well. Feel free to sing out and anything you have that comes to mind, comments, thoughts, even maybe negative reactions, we welcome fielding those as well. So many of you have been aware of the national movement that's been focused on community colleges and really increasing access and success for students. We can look back to 2009 when the Obama administration began the American Graduation Initiative, which never actually came to fruition, but was one of the first signals of really putting an emphasis and effort on what's taking place in community colleges. And we've seen throughout this current administration this enhanced focus on really elevating and highlighting the role that community college have, particularly in the terms and context of workforce development, but really in all areas and focusing on its role. And most recently, of course, we have America's College Promise, which most people know is free community college, which again is just another opportunity to do that. But really what these efforts are doing is they're highlighting, one, the role of community colleges, but two, they're also bringing critical attention to the need to increase student success. And we've seen that across the country, states have responded both to the American Graduation Initiative, this initiative, and also other initiatives that were in place before the Obama administration that really highlighted community colleges, trying to say, okay, well, how do we improve student success? And actually, if you want to go back to the beginning of it, a lot of it focused on how do we measure student success, because for folks who are in the federal government, they don't completely understand what we do. They measure graduation rates based upon first-time, full-time students, which doesn't account for a large percentage of community college students. So looking at that as a rate to determine how effective they are, it's like, well, a lot of it's been trying to educate folks on, well, we do, yes, we do transfer, but we also focus on workforce development, contract training, job training for job skills. So there's a lot of functions that community colleges have. But again, across the country, we've seen that states have been responding. In California, it's been no different. And one of the things that we've seen is this student success effort that's been taking place across the state that's really highlighting some key areas where we've been experiencing disproportionate impact, where our colleges aren't facilitating the kind of outcomes across groups that we would like to see. And as you can see here, the focus in California is to close achievement gaps in access and success in underrepresented student groups as identified by local student equity plans. And so our work sits at the nexus of this focus on historically underrepresented students in community colleges, but also sits in line with another presidential initiative which you may be familiar with, which is My Brother's Keeper. The White House launched this initiative to create opportunities for boys and men of color in society, and it has a particular focus on education. And we're glad to be affiliated with My Brother's Keeper through the Executive Alliance. They've basically the funders, private organizations that are sponsoring and actually putting the money behind My Brother's Keeper have created separate entities that do different things, and the role that our center is playing is in that through the RISE program and workforce development. So what we do in terms of the Minority Male Community College Collaborative is we're a research and practice center that's focused on men of color in community colleges, looking at how can we support community colleges in building the capacity to serve these men. A lot of the work that we do is focused on assessment, going into colleges, better understanding what are the experiences of these men and what can colleges do to take that information to employ new interventions to support their success. And when we say men of color, our focus is really on those men who have been, based upon extensive data, shown to be underrepresented across multiple levels. So that includes black males, Latinos, Southeast Asians, Native Americans, and Pacific Islanders. And as part of what we do, we have a national consortium. It's called the National Consortium of College Men of Color. And we have about 60 colleges that are part of it, where we convene them annually from across the country to come together and learn about how to do the kind of things that are important in terms of strategic planning, sustainability planning to improve efforts for these men. We also, as part of the work that we do these surveys, again, this assessment work. And I show this to say that we don't just come up and make statements because they are feel-good statements. We make statements that are based on data. So as researchers, as faculty members ourselves in a program that's focused on community college leadership, research and theory inform the statements that we make, and we think that's important to point out and highlight. So let's talk a little bit about the national picture when we're looking at men of color in community colleges. So we know that community colleges serve as the primary pathway into post-secondary education for these men. If we're looking at public institutions, we can see that about 64 to 65% of all Black and Latino men begin their educational experiences and are concentrated in community colleges, which is important because if we're going to talk about equity, if we're going to talk about success, and specifically for these men, this is where the focus needs to be. But nationally, it's not where it's been. It's been focused on men who have been in four-year institutions who have very different characteristics and very different experiences in terms of prior education and in terms of a number of other areas. But what are some things that we know about men of color? Let's talk about a little bit about some of their characteristics. So one, we know that many of them had delayed their enrollment into community college, which is not surprising because many of our students have. Average age of a community college student who's a Black male or Latino male is about 28 to 29 years old across the country. So we're not talking about, for the most part, folks who've transitioned right out of high school and they're going into community college. So as a result, they've delayed their enrollment. And that means something. If you delayed your enrollment, that means you've probably been out in the workforce or doing something else for a period of time, but it also means that you've been away from the classroom, right? So when you're away from the classroom, let's say the last time you took calculus or algebra was in 11th or 12th grade, we can then make sense to us why we see such high rates of need of developmental education for these men. And again, we see this with many other community college populations, but I think it's important to highlight because oftentimes we have this in our mind like, oh yes, it's their prior preparation. And you know, to a certain degree, there are some challenges with prior preparation, but a lot of it really deals with the fact that they've been away for a while. And you know, so we have to think about that. We know that many of them are first-generation students. We also know that many of them are low income and that many of them attend college less than full time, and that's oftentimes because they're working. So they have external pressures and commitments to other folks that they're engaged in that can then take away time that they would normally be dedicating to school. When we engage them as educators, there's kind of two different lenses to what we do that with. And this is not just, I would say, for men of color, but really for all underrepresented students. It's easy for us to be able to look at them and say, well, they're not doing well, and we know they're not doing well across the country, and the reason that they're not is because of themselves and their families, right, and their communities, and it's K-12. And it's easy to kind of look at it from that perspective. And so here's two perspectives that we see oftentimes. So one perspective you'll hear people say is, what the heck is wrong with these guys or these students? Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful here, right? It's easy to default to that because then what we've done is we place the onus of their success on them. It has to deal with their motivation, their drive, their resilience, their grit, as opposed to thinking about the things that are really within our realm of control. Because if it was just about that, if it was just about these factors, right, then our students would actually be doing well. Because in terms of our prediction models, it has much less to do with their their personal characteristics in terms of their drive, their motivation, are actually an outgrowth of the environments they're educated in. So for example, a different perspective which we advocate is looking at it and asking the question from this lens: what are we doing or not doing as a college, campus, or department that results in our students or our men of color not doing as well as they should? And we think this is important because the way that we approach our work is from a systems perspective. We oftentimes use this quote that you'll see on the top because it helps to frame how we think that colleges should go about addressing issues. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. So when we see that there's some groups that are experiencing disproportionate impact, we have to say to ourselves, not what's wrong with them, but what are we doing or not doing that's within our realm of control that can help to support these students in different ways. And one of the things that we know is, because, again, these two perspectives are very predominant, is it's much easier and we actually have much more control if we focus on the challenges that there may be in place from that second perspective. So I oftentimes show this quote because, one, it's Frank's quote, and Dr. Frank Harris and I co-direct the Minority Male Community College Collaborative at San Diego State together. Dr. Harris, can you raise your hand so folks can see you? And so he's the brains behind the operation, and I just get to work with him. And one of the things that I've seen, that this is a quote that he wrote one time, and I was like, man, I really wish I'd wrote that, because it's just so nice, and it helps to really contextualize like how we think about this issue. So he says, it's futile to dwell on students' past experiences. It's also harmful if inequalities are rationalized as beyond the control of practitioners. Instead, we must focus on what is within our control, on what is within the control of educators in terms of changing their own practices to meet the needs and circumstances of students. Why do we do it? Because it's within our control. So having this second perspective helps us because we're then focusing on what we actually have some locus of control or locus of cause around. So let's talk a little bit about one of the things that we've learned from the research that we've done. And some of it you'll see even with some parallels from the prior presenter in terms of really getting at what is the climate that these folks are being educated in and engaged in. So oftentimes when we go places around the country, the first things that we hear people say is, well, can you help us with our black males because they're not engaged, right? They're not engaged, they're not trying. And student engagement is a common concept, so common that we oftentimes just throw it around as a buzzword or even switch it out for as a catchword for student success. And student engagement, it is important. We know that it leads to success for students in terms of persistence, achievement, attainment, transfer, labor market outcomes. We know that students who are engaged are more likely to have a sense of belonging in the environment. They're more likely to experience higher, more healthy non-cognitive outcomes. All these great things that deal with engagement. But one of the things that we feel is that engagement is really an intermediate outcome. Engagement just doesn't happen. Our students aren't just disengaged. There's oftentimes things that take place in the environment that influence that. So we look at the research community, what they've done is they typically measure engagement in very simple ways. They say, in terms of surveys, how often do you spend time asking questions in class, responding to questions in class, going to faculty office hours, studying, right? Those are kind of general things that we ask about students' engagement, to participate in group discussions, to see a faculty member outside of class, walk up to them and have a conversation with them. And one of the things that men of color report to us is that these are things that oftentimes don't occur. And we know that this is important because a welcomeness to engage is interconnected with other affective outcomes from the environment, such as their sense of belonging in the environment, their perceptions of whether or not they matter. But you know what? Again, these are still not what produces it, because welcomeness to engage is an outgrowth of practice. And there's other practices that lead to that. And a lot of it deals with the relational context in terms of the relationships and personal connections that they have with faculty members. The prior speaker used the word care. It's one of the important things that comes out. In fact, from our research, we've been able to really think about this from a theoretical perspective and from a practical perspective about what are those things that are important for us to be able to teach effectively and work effectively with men of color. So, writing in the 1960s, Nevitt Sanford had this model that looked at what are the things, the two critical conditions that foster and facilitate students' growth, learning, and success, right? And he said that, you know what, there's two things that we have to have, there's two things that must be in place. The first one is that the students must be challenged. We have to provide them with content that's rigorous. We have to expose them to new concepts. We have to help them think critically about what they believe, why they believe it, and make sure that we're pushing them to that next level and making them meet their academic horizons. So challenge is critical. But challenge also has to be accompanied, he said, with support. So students have to be supported. And we think about support, we like to think about the availability of faculty members, meeting with students before class and after class, being available during office hours, having students have their email or office phone and being able to call and be able to get support. And we recognize, and one of the things that he said was that there really has to be an optimal balance between these two things, right? So if you're in an environment and there's lots of challenge and very little support, what's going to happen? Students are going to become disaffected, right? They're going to become discouraged because it's a challenge for them. And if you're in an environment where there's too much support and there's too little challenge, then what we're doing is we're coddling students and we're not allowing them to grow in the ways that they need. But the problem with this research is it assumes that there's conditions that are in place that oftentimes for our underrepresented students rarely, if ever, are. Those conditions serve to prime their ability to be able to do these things and engage in these things. So for example, in terms of challenge, we know that challenge has to be accompanied with high expectations. You can push a student all you want, you can give them difficult work to do, but if they don't believe that you believe that they can do it, they're never going to rise to that challenge. The other piece that's important here is with support. You can provide support, but if the student doesn't think that you care about them, then they're not going to use that support. So I'm sure many folks in this room would say, I do these things, and that's great. We need to then go out and talk to other educators who might not be conceptualizing this in the same way and recognize that challenge and support have to be met with high expectations and authentic care if we're going to create a holistic pattern of student success. And so one of the things we want to do is look at some of the data that we saw for this campus. And this is based upon completion rate data, and this is basically from the scorecard. And we recognize that across the country, again, there's challenges for underrepresented students, and oftentimes for men, and then in particular, oftentimes for men of color. It just depends upon the campus context in terms of what that looks like. Sometimes it's across the board, sometimes it's Latino men, sometimes it's really African American men in terms of what the college is doing to facilitate outcomes for them, right? And one of the things that we saw here in looking at the data for this campus is there is a challenge in terms of the college facilitating successful outcomes for African American men. But what we've done here is we've highlighted in red other groups that are also of interest that really in terms of where you see the average for the population in terms of the gender average, they're falling significantly below that percentage. And so there's work to be done. But guess what? Everywhere we go, there's work to be done. And we know that every educator can effectively teach these students. But it's about putting the practices in place that enables you to be able to do that, which is why you should come to the workshops. I'm going to skip through this and really get to some of the additional theory that we have that kind of surrounds this so you can see a little bit of the data that we have. So this is our SEO model. We call it the socio-ecological outcomes model. And basically, it's our way of thinking about what are those factors that primarily affect success for these men. So we see on the left-hand side, these are inputs. These are factors that they come into college with based upon their background characteristics and defining characteristics such as their age, whether or not they're veterans, disability status. We also see societal factors that influence them. And the confluence of these factors influence these interrelated factors, these four interrelated factors in the center, which we call the socio-ecological domains. And these four domains are interrelated, and they're what we know has the greatest influence and success for these students. And so we know that holistically, the combination of all these factors, relate to those student success outcomes that you see in the right-hand side. So we're gonna talk a little bit about what we've learned that basically kind of helped us to inform the development of this model. And the first thing that we've learned, and it's based upon this model, we learned that society matters. We know that men of color that work with them are oftentimes socialized to perceive education that's something that's not for them. We also know, and we can look around the country and see many things that have been occurring that have really highlighted this. We've seen high-profile slayings of African American men such as Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and whether or not the specifics of those cases, we can dispute the specifics of each of those cases, paint a pattern that does admit that there are some perceptions of these men that view them as criminals, right? But I have good news for you. There's a magic barrier, and when you walk into the community colleges, all those societal perceptions of men of color disappear. Okay, I'm kidding. So oftentimes, what happens is those perceptions that we have of men of color in society come with us into the classroom. And oftentimes, educators don't have this hardcore hatred towards men of color. It's just those subtle things, those slight pauses and reactions when a student approaches you and you step back for a second because you're taught to think that there's someone you should fear. And just that slight reaction, even though then right after that you step forward and engage them, that slight. And this is one of the things that we know is from our research that men of color, oftentimes, they report that they have an apprehension to engage. And this is a lot of times, it's based upon how these societal factors influence them in college. So let me tell you what that is. So when we've done focus groups with men of color, one of the things that they say is, well, I'm not really engaged in the class. And we say, oh, well, what do you mean? Well, when the faculty member asks a question, like, I'll know the answer, but I won't respond. Or when the faculty member says, do you have a question? Actually, there's something I need to ask, but ignorant. They'll think that I'm stupid. There's other words that we use that we can't use in public. But these are things that we know occur, right? That there's these perceptions that they perceive that faculty members view them in this way, but also that their peers in the class view them this way, right? So this is an important piece that we have to recognize. The other thing that we have to recognize is that non-cognitive factors matter as well. So we look at this in a number of different ways. We look at what we call interpersonal factors, such as self-efficacy. We look at basically in putting these in kind of more accessible terms, students' confidence in their academic abilities, their feeling of control over academic endeavors, their perceptions of the utility of college, their focus that they have in school, and their authentic interest and enjoyment of learning. And we know that these things influence their success on campus. And we know that they are shaped by their prior educational experiences, but guess what? We know that they're more so influenced by the campus environment that they're educated in. The other thing that we've learned that's been critical is that identity matters. Oftentimes when we talk about men, and we talk about men of color, we forget that there's identity that's associated with that. And that identity has a strong influence on their outcomes and their success. We measure, in particular, we focus a lot on masculine identity, and this is because Dr. Harris's work in this area, he's one of the leading scholars that focuses on how masculinity influences success for men and men of color in college. And we look at this, and in our work, we measure this in several different ways. And I'd like to share with you some of those because I think it might help us to think about what we might do as educators in responding to this. So one of the things we look at is what's called breadwinner orientation. We recognize that oftentimes men are socialized to perceive that one of their primary roles is to be that of a breadwinner for themselves and their families. And so when they have these roles, oftentimes then when they're in college environments that can require delayed gratification, that can take away time that they could be otherwise doing things that would be earning money or providing for others, it can conflict with their identity, that socialized identity that they had to be able to do this. And this affects all men, not just men of color, but of course it has an acute effect on these men. And so there's a quote here on the board that helps to contextualize this. And this is from Dr. Harris's work with Sean Harper. And it says, "What kind of man has 2 kids and quits working so he can go and read poetry at some damn college?" Powerful quote when you think about it, the conflict that some of these men have. Help seeking. We know that men are oftentimes socialized not to seek out and reach out for help, because by doing so, if you have to ask for help, you're perceived as being weak, inferior. And this, we know, has a direct influence on their success in college. Because if I'm a male, or I'm a male of color, and I believe that by asking for help, I'm going to be perceived as weak, am I going to go to my faculty member if I need help? Am I going to go to tutoring, counseling, academic advising, or use those support services? I'm going to be more apprehensive to do so. And so we have to think about that. How do we structure our classroom environments where students don't have to ask, where it's intrusive, it's high touch, where it's an expectation? These are things that we need to consider. Another one that we look at is school as a feminine domain. If you were to look at the typical demographic of a K-12 teacher, it would be that of a white female. As a result, the socialized power structure in that classroom is one that is both white and feminine. So for students of color in general, when they engage in that classroom, right, they are engaging in an environment that is not reflective of them, oftentimes. As men, when they're engaged in that environment, they have experienced the same thing. So when you put these two identities together, you can see how it can create an added sense of conflict and identity. And oftentimes this has to just do with the actual structure of the folks that have been hired. And it's no different throughout the other educational levels. In fact, in community colleges, the demographic is very similar in terms of the racial demographic. And so we can't avoid conversations on race. We can't ignore conversations on race because they're critical. We have to recognize that race matters, and it plays an influence in how these individuals interpret and engage in their environments. So here's some data that helps contextualize this. This is from our surveys of men. And one of the things that you can see from this is that 26% of the Black and Latino men in our samples have reported on average, and it varies across colleges, sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, that they're apprehensive to seek out help. And we know, again, based upon the research literature, why that occurs. So it's critical for us to think about what can we do as educators to employ policies in our class and practices, more importantly, that can actually help and support them. We also know that environment matters to an extent. And I say to an extent because oftentimes when we talk about environment, it's one of those things where we can easily push the issues over here and not worry about it and say, well, you know, it's their external environment, there's very little we can do. But we know that it has an effect on their success, but only to an extent, and that effect is actually mitigated by the campus environment. But here's some things that we do know. We do know that men of color in particular, there can be challenges with employment. We know that employment in college is actually a good thing. Some people will tell you that it's not, but no, it's actually a good thing to work up to a certain point. We don't want students working full-time. We don't want students working not at all. We want them somewhere in that sweet spot in the middle. And it's best if that employment is connected to whatever academic degree or career training that they're doing. But we know that they're concentrated in 3 types of jobs based upon the research that we've done. One, they're in jobs that are oftentimes physically demanding. So this is boxing shelves, digging ditches, moving things. These are oftentimes things that when we talk with men of color, these are the jobs that they have. So these jobs are physically taxing. We also know that oftentimes because of a number of different factors, one of them being stereotypes and racism, that they get the worst shifts and oftentimes work that late night shift. And we talk to them and we're like, oh yeah, so when are you going to work? Oh, well, I go to work at midnight. Well, when's your first class? Well, I have class at 7 or 7:30. Of course, this speaks to the need to ask these men about what they're engaged in before they take whatever courses or assign whatever courses they're going to take. We also know that they're concentrated in jobs that are transitory in nature. So oftentimes these are jobs that last for a certain period of time, and then they're over, and then they're looking for a new job, and then they're in a new job, and it lasts for a certain period of time, then it's over. So when you're going through these transitions, constant transitions outside of campus, right, it makes it more difficult to be able to engage fully in campus because, for those of you who are new faculty here, how many new faculty are there here? Right? You recognize that starting here, it's a new transition for you. There's things that you have to learn. There's climate, there's culture, there's policies, there's practices, there's people. Imagine having to do that every several months. It can be difficult. We also know that men in general and men of color, of course, more acutely experience what we refer to as stressful life events. And we measure that in the survey work that we do in a number of different ways. We say in the past 2 years, how many major stressful life events have you had? And we give them examples, and those examples include divorce, loss of a job, eviction, relationship breakup, incarceration, a major change at work, illness in the family, death of a close family member or friend. And we know that on average they experience 4 to 5 major stressful life events. And so when these events take place, they oftentimes pull them away from their focus in school. And we see them in the classroom and sometimes we say, oh, well, so-and-so isn't focused. But we don't oftentimes realize the many incredible things that they're going through, which speaks even more to the importance of having those contacts and relationships with them. And all this really leads up to the final and most important piece, which we'll spend the rest of our time on, and that is climate. Because climate matters. In terms of the work that we do, we recognize that climate is one of the most significant predictors of their success. And we look at success in numerous different ways. We look at it in terms of non-cognitive outcomes, in terms of their focus in college. We look at motivation. We look at achievement based upon their GPAs. We look at persistence. We look at transfer readiness, graduation readiness. So across numerous different outcomes, we know that the most important predictor of their success is how they experience the campus climate. Far and beyond anything that happens in their background lives or their external lives. In fact, we have a slide that'll show it in a little bit, but I'll just go ahead and preview it for you. We've done models, lots of models, where we've done basically like hierarchical models. So the first set of models we run are based upon their background and their environmental characteristics. So looking at their age, their income, whether they're working, whether they have dependents, how long they're commuting to and from campus. We look at stressful life events. We look at whether their mother went to college, their father went to college. We look at their degree expectations. We look at all these factors, and we run them in models to look at what predicts their focus and their success in school. And then, after that, we run models where we say, okay, but let's add on this climate piece. And we add in measures of their sense of belonging in school, particularly as it relates to their relationship with faculty, the perceptions of whether they feel welcome to engage with them, and whether or not they receive validation from them. The first models we run count for about 10 to 16% of the variance in their success across groups. Other models run from 26 up to 40-something% of the variance in their success, which tells us something that's very good news. We have more of an effect on their success than all of the external pressures and background characteristics that they come in with. Which is, again, why we go back to this perspective that we have that focuses on institutional responsibility. What are we doing as a college, as a campus? What am I doing as a faculty member in my classroom? What am I doing as a counselor in my office that's influencing success for this student. Here's one of the charts that we've come up with. It just talks about validation that they receive in their environments. And the validation that they receive is, we look at it in a number of different ways. So we ask them about how often do you have experience where a faculty member communicates to you messages like, you can do it, you belong here, you can succeed, I believe in you. How often do they hear those messages from their faculty members? And we ask them to essentially count it up for us. And we also ask them the same thing with staff. And as you can see in this, roughly 50% of the men in the sample don't receive this validation. And again, it's one of those things where it depends upon the campus that you go to, but most of the time across the board, you'd be surprised how little that validation is received. But I bet you, if we were to ask faculty members or staff members, how often do they do these things, they would say that, well, I do it a lot. But there's a disconnect, right? So sometimes the message that's intended is not the message that's received. And sometimes we think that we're communicating it, but we're communicating the opposite. So it becomes very important to verbally say these things. This is really great work. You did a good job on this assignment. Keep it coming. Or, you know, what you shared in class yesterday was excellent. I hope you can share again today. Messages like that are authentic have an incredible amount of an effect on their success. Another thing that we measure is their sense of belonging. How many of you have heard that term before, sense of belonging? Is that it, really? I'll raise them high? Okay. So sense of belonging is this really unique concept. So if you were to go back into the student success literature from like way back, oftentimes what it did is it focused on basically student predictors of their performance. So for example, I talked about engagement earlier. That's really based upon a work from George Crew and Robert Pace that focus on quality of student effort. So the more a student puts in, the harder they work, the better they do. Well, the research literature has transitioned from that, recognizing that yes, student effort is critical, but student effort is primarily a function of the environment. And so there's these other concepts that have emerged. One was 1970s, 1975, Vincent Tinto's model of integration, right? Which basically said the more students involved academically, the more they're involved socially on campus, the better they're going to do. And these things, make sense. And so scholars, we went out and we're like, okay, well, let's measure this. And if you look at the federal government and their data sets, how they measure it is they say, how often do you ask questions in class? How often do you talk with your faculty inside of class, outside of class, go to their office hours? This is looking at how often do you do something. And one of the things that we learned is, well, yes, that's important to know how often something happens, but it's just like that chart I showed earlier, how often something happens is, again, an outgrowth of their environment. So whether or not that they're doing those things is a function of whether they feel like they belong in that environment, right? So scholars have really talked about this and noted that when students feel a sense of belonging, they're much more likely to persist, achieve, attain, to transfer, to have healthy experiences, to really view their educational experience as something that was worthwhile and meaningful. So this sense of belonging is critical. And the way that we measure it, the way that we look at it, is we ask them, it from the perspective of what do you think your faculty thinks about your belonging? Does your faculty member care about you, care about your success, value interacting with you, believe you belong here? And some of the times the responses that we get are just disparate. And we recognize that students have very difficult experiences. And those experiences shape how they engage in that environment. Another thing that we know, and I think that this is important because we've talked a little bit about this, and in the next session we'll talk a lot about what takes place in the class, but it's also a lot about what takes place outside of the class. So one of the things that we know is that out-of-class engagement, out-of-class interactions with faculty members is significantly more important for student success than oftentimes what takes place in class. And you might be saying to yourself, well, how could that be? Well, it's because what happens outside of the class is what it creates those conditions for those personal relationships with students. When you're in a class full of people, it's a little bit more difficult for me to sit here and establish a relationship with you than it is if we're outside and we're one-on-one and we're talking to people. And so it becomes critical for faculty members to have those interactions with students. But this is one of the things we know about men of color. And when we interview them, when we talk with them, when we survey them, we repeatedly find the same thing. We ask them, what do your experiences look like with faculty members outside of class? Again, knowing that this is most critical to their success. And they'll say, well, when my faculty member sees me, they'll see me and they'll pretend that they're on their phone. Or they'll walk the other direction. They'll pick up their phone. They'll pretend like they don't see me so that there's no interaction. And a faculty member might respond and say, yeah, I'm teaching at 3 different campuses, and I'm part-time at all of them, or I'm full-time here, and I'm serving on this committee and this committee, and I'm just trying to get my things done, but not realizing that they're having such a negative effect on student success. And so what's sad is that when we talk with men of color, one of the things that we've learned is that when we say, well, then who do you interact with on campus other than your faculty members? Because they say that for the most part, many of them don't. They say, well, the person who I talk to the most and I have the most interactions with is the custodian or the groundskeeper or the person in the cafeteria. And oftentimes we find out that those are the people who are most likely to give them those important, validating messages. You can do it. You belong here. You can succeed. I believe in you. And when we find this out, of course, it's crushing to hear, but it also makes us recognize that some of this may be the people who are oftentimes hired for those jobs are oftentimes the people who are most reflective of them. So it speaks to the importance of how do we go about creating those out-of-class interactions with students, with men of color, in ways that are meaningful, that are affirming, that are going to lead to their success. So one of the things I'm going to do here is conclude with just some meta-level findings that we've had based upon the data that we've done. So in terms of black male success, and looking at specifically persistence. And persistence is definitely not the only measure of success. In fact, it's an okay measure, because oftentimes what we find is that men of color are persisting, but they're not completing. So we got to view these as 2 different things. But it's still important to look at. And so what we've done is with the survey work that we've done, we have it's called the Community College Survey of Men. And we've surveyed over 12,000 men across 8 states at 60 community colleges, 60. And we've taken that data to look at what are the correlates and the predictors of their success based upon the items that we collect. And so here are some things that come up as being important. Service efficacy. It's one thing to have campus services. It's another thing for students to perceive those services as being critical to their success, to actually helping them with the help that they need. And one of the things that we find is that when they don't believe that the folks in student services care about them, when they don't believe those services are critical to their success, not surprisingly, they then don't use them. And then, of course, those are the services that oftentimes they need. Service access. Again, you can have services. I can be a faculty member. Let's put this in a faculty context. I can be a faculty member. I can have office hours, right? But if my office hours aren't at a time that you can come, it's no sense for me having office hours. We have to think about that with services that we have as well. Racial gender stereotypes. One of the things we ask them is about their perceptions of whether faculty members, staff members, and other students have stereotypes about them, about men from their same racial ethnic gender group. And we know that it does have a negative effect on their success when they're aware of those stereotypes that are in place. A sense of belonging with faculty, it's critical. We also see, again, we're talking about men, we're talking about men of color. We have to recognize what is the role of those non-cognitive factors, those identity factors. And we see perceptions of school as a feminine domain, having a positive regard for their own racial community, help-seeking, and their views of healthiness around competition influence their success. And if you look on the far right-hand side, the three strongest predictors that emerged across the colleges that we worked with are service efficacy, again, whether those services they believe are actually critical in helping them get the resources and support that they need, willingness to seek out help, based upon how they've been socialized, and faculty validation. So we have to then look at this and say, well, what is it that we can do about these things? And actually what's really cool is we have some even newer data that we've been collecting with a kind of revised version of our instrument. We continue to improve the work that we do. And interestingly, in that newest data, service efficacy has fallen out. And welcomeness to engage outside of the classroom has come up into the top 3. Which says to me, again, these are things that we have control over. These are things that we can do something about as faculty members. We talked a lot about black males. Let's also talk a little bit about Latino males as well. Again, our work does focus on black males, but we are also cognizant of the factors that influence success for other men of color. One group that we really didn't talk about today that's really critical are Southeast Asian men. We know that Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian, Vietnamese men have experiences and outcomes that are similar to and on par with black and Latino men. And so that's another critical group that's difficult the campuses are struggling to serve. So correlates of Latino male success. You'll see that there's actually a lot of similarities. Service efficacy, service access, the perceptions of whether staff members care about them, those presence, again, of stereotypes in the environment. Again, we can see those non-cognitive factors, those identity factors coming into play. And then when we go over to those 3 strongest predictors, wow, commonalities. We see help seeking, access to services, and their perceptions of whether school is a domain primarily for women or one that's equally suited for men and women. These are important factors to recognize. And guess what? Again, with the newest data that we have, the newest stuff that's hot off the shelf, a lot of these drop out, and up comes validation with faculty and welcomeness to engage, but for this group, inside of class. It helps us to paint a picture that, one, as faculty members, we have to be focused on what we're doing in terms of those relationships with students, and then 2, it tells us we can't divorce identity from conversations on student success. It's too easy to do. And it's too critical to overlook. Lastly, and then we'll maybe have a time for a couple questions, is multi-ethnic men. One of the things that we've seen in the colleges that we've been surveying is that a group that oftentimes comes up as being really overlooked in terms of campus interventions, but really one of the groups that experiences some of the most deleterious outcomes and experiences are multi-ethnic men. Now, obviously that's a broad categorization. And oftentimes when we look to see who those men are, there's numerous combinations. But one of the things that we know about these men, if you look at those 3 strongest predictors, that there's, again, some things here that are a little different than the rest of the other men of color. And so, again, to me, this says, wow, look at the role that identity has. Look at these predictors. Service efficacy, yes, that's the same. Locus of control, feeling like you have control over your academic future. And feeling a sense of connectedness to the campus. Very different predictors, of course. Now, they're getting at very, very much the same underlying themes. But it helps us to think about how we have to be really cognizant of going deep. And that's why, for me, when we see colleges say, hey, we looked at data by race, we looked at data by gender, and we looked at data by age, that's great, but what about the intersections? When we get down deeper, that's where we find the nuggets, and that's where we find the pieces that are most useful for facilitating success. We're going to continue this conversation in the next session, where we're going to talk specifically about what are some strategies, some very specific strategies that faculty members can use in facilitating teaching and learning for men of color. We hope that you'll come to that session and learn some things that maybe you didn't know before, and also share your perspectives on some things that maybe you have found that have been working. And at this point, do we have time for maybe one or two questions? A couple questions? Great. Yes. Yes. So direction and size basically deals with the size of the effect of these on their success. So let's go back to Blackman. For example, service efficacy, having services that are critical to their success, their perception of that, has a positive effect on their success, and it's large, meaning that it's the most meaningful. As opposed to, let's go down to competitive ethos among men, it has a positive effect, meaning that they have a healthy view of competition, right? But it has a moderate effect, meaning it's important, but not as important really as the service efficacy. So I didn't go a lot into how we broke down some of the data, but if you actually, this is a slide I didn't show, this is where we get some of this information, and part of it's based upon standardized beta coefficients from our regression models. Yeah. Maybe one more question? Any disagreements are good? No? All right, well, with that, thank you for your time. All right, appreciate it.
So thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to Dr. Wood, Dr. Harris, Dr. Gooseby-Smith. One more round of applause for all of our presenters today. So the next sessions are scheduled to start, I believe, at 10:45. You have them in your program. Many of them are over in the forum classrooms or science and math or Dorico. I encourage you to attend one of those sessions. I also want to thank Dr. Hart for inviting all staff to attend this session and one of the workshops that's coming up at 10:45. With that, I just want to encourage you to have a great day and a great year. And Scott Martin, wherever you are, I'll meet you in the parking lot, all right? Thanks.